In the shadow of the Sierra Nevada, where the wind howled like a vengeful spirit and snow buried dreams under endless white, a group of ordinary Americans faced the unimaginable, and in their desperate fight for survival, they revealed the darkest and most resilient corners of the human soul. It was the spring of 1846, and America pulsed with the fever of manifest destiny. From the fertile fields of Illinois, a wagon train rolled westward, carrying families who believed California's golden promise awaited them just beyond the horizon. They were not soldiers or explorers by trade, but farmers, merchants, mothers, and children, pioneers chasing a better life in the young republic's expanding frontier. Among them were the Donners and the Reeds, whose names would forever etch a tale of ambition, tragedy, and horror into the annals of American history. James Frazier Reed, a prosperous businessman from Springfield, Illinois, led a prosperous household. Tall, decisive, and hot-tempered, he traveled with his wife Margaret, their 4 children, and several hired hands. Nearby rode his friends and neighbors, the Donner brothers, George and Jacob, wealthy farmers with large families of their own. George Donner, at 62, was optimistic and well-respected. His younger brother Jacob shared the vision of fertile lands where cattle grazed freely and fortunes could be made. Together with dozens of others, totaling around 87 souls in 23 wagons, they departed Springfield on April 12, 1846, joining larger caravans at Independence, Missouri. The early weeks were filled with the rhythm of westward migration, creaking axles, lowing oxen, campfires under starry skies, and songs of hope. Children played along the trail, women cooked simple meals, and men repaired wheels and hunted game. They followed the established Oregon Trail, a route worn by thousands before them. At Fort Laramie in Wyoming, the party made a fateful decision. Lansford W. Hastings, an ambitious promoter, had published a guide promising a new shortcut through the Great Basin, the Hastings Cutoff, that would save hundreds of miles and bring them swiftly to California's promised valleys. Despite warnings from experienced mountain men like James Clyman, who urged them to stick to the known path, the group, eager to beat the winter snows and perhaps arrive first to claim the best lands, veered off. This choice marked the beginning of their descent. The Hastings Cutoff proved a nightmare of uncharted terrain. They hacked through the Wasatch Mountains, building roads where none existed, only to face the brutal expanse of the Great Salt Lake Desert. Oxen weakened and died under the scorching sun. Wagons sank into salt flats, water sources vanished. Precious time slipped away. By the time they reached the Humboldt River in late September, exhaustion and short supplies plagued them. Arguments flared. Reed, in a fit of rage during a dispute, killed a teamster named Snyder with a knife. Though the party held a makeshift trial and banished him temporarily, the incident sowed division. As October deepened, the Sierra Nevada loomed ahead like a granite wall guarding paradise. They pushed on, reaching Truckee Lake, now Donner Lake, at the foot of the pass in late October. Snow had already begun to dust the peaks. On October 31, a fierce blizzard struck. The party, now split between camps at the lake and Alder Creek a few miles back where the Donners lagged due to a wagon accident, found themselves trapped. 8 days of relentless snow followed. The passes were sealed under drifts 20 feet deep. Their oxen wandered off or were buried. Food dwindled to meager rations of boiled hides and bones. Patrick Breen, an Irish immigrant traveling with his wife Peggy and their 7 children, began keeping a diary on November 20. His entries, stark and unadorned, provide the only contemporary record of the ordeal. Nov 20 came to this place on the 31st of last month. It snowed all night. We now have killed most of our cattle. Day after day, the entries chronicled deepening despair. Freezing temperatures, failed attempts to cross the summit on foot, the death of Bailey's Williams from starvation on December 15, the first recorded in the camps. Families huddled in crude cabins of logs, brush, and wagon canvas. Children cried for food that wasn't there. Men grew gaunt, their eyes hollow. Women rationed every scrap, sewing blankets from ox hides. By mid-December, with no relief in sight and starvation gnawing at their bellies, a group of 17, mostly men but including 2 women and 2 Miwok Indian guides, set out on what became known as the Forlorn Hope. They snowshoed across the mountains, carrying little more than blankets and strips of dried meat. Blizzards blinded them. Frostbite claimed toes and fingers. One by one they fell. Mr. Stanton, the faithful guide who had stayed with them, others collapsed from exhaustion. In their desperation, the survivors resorted to the unthinkable, eating the flesh of the dead to continue. 2 of the Indian guides were shot when ammunition ran low and hunger overwhelmed mercy. Only 7 of the Forlorn Hope reached help in California's Sacramento Valley in late January 1847. Their tales shocked rescuers into action. Back at the camps, horror deepened. Patrick Breen's diary continued its grim chronicle. Deck 25, we are all weak, snow about 8 feet deep. Deaths mounted. George Donner weakened from an infected hand wound. His wife Tamsin stayed by his side. Jacob Donner's family suffered terribly. Louis Kesseberg, a German immigrant known for his strength but also his volatile nature, became a figure of fear and necessity. As bodies lay frozen around the cabins, the living turned to them for sustenance. Not all did so willingly. Some resisted until delirium set in. Mothers like Peggy Breen protected their children fiercely, but even they faced impossible choices. The first relief party, led by men like Aquila Glover and guided by survivors of the Forlorn Hope, reached the lake camps in mid-February. What they found was nightmarish. Emaciated figures crawling from snow-covered shelters, delirious with hunger, surrounded by evidence of the desperate measures taken. They rescued 23 people, mostly women and children, carrying the weakest on litters. James Reed, who had gone ahead earlier and now joined rescuers, found his family alive but shattered. Multiple relief expeditions followed through March and April, each braving the treacherous passes. The last survivor, Louis Kesseberg, was brought out on April 21. Of the original 87, only 48 survived. 40 perished from starvation, exposure, and related causes. The survivors' stories spread like wildfire across America. Virginia Reed, James's daughter, later wrote poignant letters urging others not to take shortcuts. Never take no kudoffs and hurry along as fast as you can. Newspapers sensationalized the cannibalism, turning the Donner Party into a symbol of the frontier's perils. Yet many survivors rebuilt lives in California, contributing to the state's growth during the gold rush that soon followed. The Breens thrived. The Reeds prospered. Even Kesseberg, dogged by accusations, lived into old age running a hotel. The tragedy of the Donner Party remains one of the most compelling chapters in American westward expansion. It warns of hubris against nature's power, the fragility of civilization when survival hangs by a thread, and the extraordinary will to endure. Their route through the mountains is now traversed by Interstate 80, and Donner Lake and Donner Pass bear their name, a haunting reminder etched into the landscape. In the years that followed, historians pieced together diaries, letters, and interviews. The party's ordeal was not mere bad luck but a cascade of decisions. Late start, unproven shortcut, underestimation of the Sierra's fury. Yet in their suffering they embodied the pioneer spirit, the drive that built a nation, even at an unimaginable cost. Their story, passed down through generations, continues to astonish, inform, and grip the imagination of all who hear it. Ordinary people, pushed to the edge, who stared into the abyss, and some of them found a way back. To truly grasp the magnitude of the Donner Party tragedy, we must venture past the raw statistics and step into the suffocating darkness of those buried cabins, where the line between humanity and animal survival completely dissolved. While the camps at Donner Lake suffered in darkness, the Forlorn Hope Snowshoe Party was living through a literal nightmare on the high peaks. 17 souls had set out into the blinding white wilderness, carrying nothing but desperate prayers and a mere 6 days of meager rations. Within days, the mountain storms obliterated any sense of direction, burying their path under monstrous drifts of snow. Freezing winds whipped across the Sierra Nevada ridges like 1,000 blades, and frostbite quickly claimed fingers and toes, turning flesh black and useless. Among them was Charles Stanton, a man who had already proved his heroic loyalty by riding ahead to California months earlier and returning with vital supplies to save the wagon train. He had won his freedom and safety, yet his conscience compelled him to return into the jaws of winter to guide his friends. Now, blind from the relentless glare of the snow and utterly crippled by frostbite, Stanton realized his failing strength was dragging the entire group down to their deaths. On the morning of December 21st, as the shivering survivors packed their frozen blankets to move on, Stanton remained seated by the dying embers of the campfire, calmly smoking his pipe. When his companions softly asked if he was coming with them, he looked out into the white abyss and whispered for them to go on, promising he would look after himself. They left him there, a lonely silhouette against the mountain ice, sacrificing his life so that others might have a fighting chance to reach the valley. As the days crawled by, starvation completely fractured the group's morality, stripping away the thin veneer of human civilization. Their eyes, hollowed by hunger, eventually turned toward Louis and Salvador, the two young Miwok Indian guides who had bravely volunteered to help the pioneers. Sensing that the desperate survivors were shifting from companions to predators, the two young men slipped away silently into the frozen night, running for their lives. But starvation was a relentless tracker, and the white wilderness left nowhere to hide. Weak, exhausted, and dying of exposure, Louis and Salvador were tracked down days later. In an act of pure madness driven by the primitive urge to survive, William Foster raised his weapon and shot them both. They were the only members of the entire Donner Party ordeal to be actively hunted and murdered for sustenance, leaving a dark, permanent stain on an already pitch-black tale of American history. Back at the lower camps near the frozen lake, the log cabins had transformed into dark, underground dungeons. Buried beneath 20 feet of heavy, packed snow, true daylight never reached the desperate souls trapped inside, and the air became a toxic, suffocating mix of wood smoke, damp animal hides, and the heavy stench of rotting flesh. Inside the Breen cabin, Patrick Breen's diary became a terrifying window into a slow-motion apocalypse happening beneath the snowdrifts. He recorded that Mrs. Murphy feared the wolves would soon dig up the shallow graves of the dead, and noted with chilling monotony that they had absolutely nothing left to eat but the hard, bitter ox hides that had previously served as their roofs and beds. The mental agony of their isolation grew far worse than the physical gnawing of hunger, causing minds to shatter in the darkness. Mothers sat helplessly watching their children's skin turn translucent and brittle, their eyes sinking deep into their skulls as life slowly faded away. When the last scraps of ox hides were boiled into a sickening, glue-like jelly and consumed, the survivors faced the ultimate horror. To stay alive, they were forced to dig through the snow tunnels to retrieve the frozen, stiff bodies of their dead neighbors, their lifelong friends, and eventually their own family members. To lessen the unbearable psychological horror of eating their own kin, desperate families began swapping the bodies of their deceased loved ones with neighboring cabins. They lived day and night alongside severed limbs and exposed skeletal remains, trying to maintain some twisted form of sanity for the sake of the crying children who still clung to life. On February 19, 1847, a faint shout echoed across the silent, deathly white valley, breaking months of isolation. The first relief party had finally breached the treacherous mountain passes. The hardened rescuers expected to find a structured pioneer camp, but instead, they looked out over a vast, empty expanse of snow with nothing but small wisps of smoke rising out of holes in the earth. As they approached, a ghostly, emaciated woman crawled out of one of the snow tunnels, her face blackened by soot, her clothing hanging in shredded tatters from her skeletal frame. She stared at the rugged men in absolute disbelief, sank to her knees on the frozen ground, and cried out a chilling question that would echo through history, asking if they were men from heaven or where they had come from. But this rescue was far from a swift or happy ending. It was an agonizing logistical nightmare. The rescuers could only carry a very limited supply of food and could only guide the strongest individuals back over the steep, icy peaks. They were forced to make heart-wrenching, brutal choices about who was viable enough to walk out and who had to be left behind to wait for the next wave of help. Margaret Reed faced a mother's ultimate torment during this forced selection. On the grueling trek up the mountain pass, two of her youngest children, Patty and Tommy, became completely paralyzed by weakness and could no longer climb. The rescuers delivered a brutal ultimatum, stating that the children had to be carried back down to the starvation cabins, or the entire party would perish on the mountain. Margaret had to stand on the icy ridge and watch her helpless children being carried back down into the snowy hell, utterly unsure if she would ever see them alive again. A few miles away at the isolated camp of Alder Creek, the Donner family was experiencing an even more horrific fate. They had no sturdy log cabins for shelter, only crude, freezing tents fashioned from frayed wagon canvas that offered zero protection from the blizzards. George Donner, the respected leader who had started the westward journey with such grand ambitions, lay entirely helpless, his arm completely consumed by an agonizing case of gangrene. When the third relief party reached their camp, George was far too close to death to survive the brutal mountain crossing. His devoted wife, Tamsin Donner, was remarkably healthy and could have easily walked out to safety with the rescuers to secure her own survival. Yet, she utterly refused to abandon her dying husband in his final hours. She kissed her young children goodbye, pushed them forward into the care of the rescue party, and turned back alone into the white wilderness to watch her husband pass away. What occurred next at Alder Creek in the closing days of the winter remains one of the greatest mysteries and dark horrors of the American frontier. When the fourth and final relief party arrived in mid-April to salvage whatever property remained, the spring sun was finally melting the snow, uncovering a gruesome, nightmarish landscape of scattered human bones and mutilated remains. Only one living soul was left alive in the entire camp, a German immigrant named Louis Kesselberg. He was discovered alone in a ruined cabin, surrounded by a pot of fresh human meat and the wealthy belongings of the deceased Donner family. Tamsin Donner's body was never recovered, but Kesselberg was found in possession of her family's hidden gold. Immediate and furious accusations spread that Kesselberg had murdered the heroic Tamsin for her wealth and her flesh. Although Kesselberg vehemently denied the murder charges for the remainder of his life, public opinion instantly branded him an absolute monster. Years later, he attempted to rebuild his life by opening a restaurant in Sacramento, but the citizens completely boycotted his business, refusing to ever eat food prepared by a man they believed to be a cold-blooded cannibal. Of the original 87 pioneers who took the fateful Hastings cutoff, only 48 walked out of those mountains alive, carrying deep physical and psychological scars that would never truly heal. The children who survived grew up with the haunting memory of the taste of human flesh, while the adults spent their remaining years trying to escape the sensationalized, cruel headlines of the American press. Yet, out of the immense horror rose stories of unimaginable human resilience. Against all mathematical and biological odds, the Reed family survived completely intact, with every single family member making it out alive. Virginia Reed, the young girl who witnessed the depths of the tragedy, later penned a letter to her cousin that stands as the ultimate epitaph for the entire ordeal, warning others to never take any shortcuts and to hurry along as fast as they can. The tragedy of the Donner Party remains a haunting mirror held up to human nature, proving that when the thin veneer of civilization is brutally stripped away by nature's fury, humans are capable of the deepest darkness, but also possesses an unbreakable, miraculous will to survive. The beautiful, snow-capped peaks of the Sierra Nevada stand today not just as a monument to nature's raw power, but as a silent gravestone for ordinary people who dared to chase the golden promise of a dream and paid an unimaginable price.